Yo guys, welcome to the Zelda fiction. Today we are gonna see, what if Naruto fell in love with Elsa? Part 1. Huge shout out to by Harpra for this story. If you end up liking this video, please consider subscribe, so without further ado, let's get into the video. All was well with the world as Naruto finally succeeded in life. After so long the war was over and he had defeated Kaguya. The village had finally given him the respect he had yearned for all these years. And Sasuke had finally returned to the village in their time of need. Now if only he wasn't burning to death from his own chakra. While victorious he had used too much of the QB's chakra in conjunction with the invincibility of his sage mode and was now suffering the backlash of combining the two powerful forces into one for so long. The massive amount of energy released had left his chakra coils so expanded that the QB had to continually push chakra through his system to keep it from collapsing in on itself. Leaving him with more chakra than he could use, and his body had to literally burn the chakra off in an effort to get it out of his system. Kurama was kept busy as the Bijuu directed its chakra between slowly returning Naruto's coils to normal and simultaneously healing his body from the heat damage the chakra burn was doing. Naruto's temperature had finally evened out but didn't seem like it would be dropping anytime soon. Eventually the large fox demon was forced to admit that unless something massive was done soon, Naruto would just continue to suffer before dying via immolation. Naruto looked at his friends surrounding him as he lay on the ground in agony. His body radiating so much heat that his loved ones were unable to get close enough to give him a hug or even hold his hand. Slowly the rest of the army that Naruto had led to victory circled around to watch their hero's final moments. To its credit the nine-tailed fox gave its jailer-turned-partner as much time as it could with the ones he loved after it told Naruto what needed to happen to save his life and began to direct the chakra inside Naruto's body to perform one more jutsu. Showing the Uzumaki determination once more, Naruto pushed through the pain of his burning body and looked to his precious people and smiled. "Don't worry guys," Naruto said as loud as he could so everyone heard him, "Fuzzbutt says I've got to go away, but he promised that I'll live so I'm going to continue being awesome somewhere else and you guys need to stay here and look after the place. Okay?" Naruto's ever-present smile and always optimistic attitude continued to prove infectious as all his friends promised that they too were going to continue on and make a better world. With one more weak wave goodbye Uzumaki Naruto vanished from the world that he had called home from the beginning of his life and was sent off to his next adventure. Break. While Naruto's unconscious body hurled through time and space, the QB had returned his coils back to normal and was hoping that Naruto would survive the side effects that he would have to live with. Mainly that his body temperature was insanely high right now and would be higher than normal for the rest of his life. Drained of its own chakra, Kurama could only hope that Naruto would not only live through the landing, but that he would survive long enough on his own until the Bijuu had regained enough of its own chakra to finish the healing. If only their luck could hold out long enough, Naruto would land on a nice fluffy snow-capped mountain that would keep his body chilled for the time being. If only there wasn't an ancient summoning circle carved into the earth by a group of trolls disguised as rocks that was attracting Naruto's body to it like a beacon. And if only it wasn't the middle of the hottest summer the city of Arendelle had felt in a long time. Break. Several months had passed since Elsa's coronation and subsequently her people discovering her powers. But the young queen was happy. She and her sister had returned to being the best friends they were as children. The people had fully accepted her, powers and all, trade with the other countries, besides Weaseltown, had never been better and using her gifts, she was able to put a slight damper on the blistering heat that was plaguing the town. Of course it was only by a few degrees. She wouldn't want to put Kristoff, the man many were calling her future brother-in-law, out of business, now would she? At least Olaf was enjoying the heat. Currently she was on her way to the Valley of the Living Rock to thank the trolls for helping her family as much as they have. She wished she could have come to thank them earlier, but being the new queen of the country did take up most of her time. And what free time she did have was spent with Anna as they made up for all the time together they had lost over the years. But at the current moment Kristoff had plucked up enough courage to ask Anna to join him for a picnic before he went back up the mountains to fetch more ice. So Elsa thought it would be nice to visit the trolls, especially since she had just gotten over her cold from Anna's birthday. And with there being no life-threatening need for her or her magical ice powers in town, she took the time to relax for a little bit while riding deeper into the mountains with nothing but her thoughts. And at the forefront of her thoughts was the recent want that her people expressed for their kingdom to have a king. As nice as it would be to make Kristoff a prince, many still wanted a king. While her mother had helped run the country as an excellent queen that everyone adored, they were still used to a king having final say in everything. Even their neighboring countries and trade partners had sent inquirers about any prospects for Arendelle's new king. Most of the time she would just ignore them. Truthfully Elsa wasn't sure she could find a husband. She was known as the Snow Queen and no man would be able to be near her for long periods of time. Her body was colder than a normal human, and occasionally her magic would wrap her body in a cold breeze when she became emotional. So any suitors would either have to accept a severe lack of physical intimacy or be able to stand freezing temperatures almost constantly. Neither of which seemed very likely to her. They would probably need to have separate bedchambers as well. And there was another problem: if she did get married, she would be expected to produce an heir for the throne eventually, and how would that work? Elsa was forced to stifle a giggle as she thought about a man in heavy winter clothing entering her chambers to lay with her. The image was almost too funny as she imagined that she would only be able to see his eyes under all his layers of clothing. Of course, his eyes would be a blue color that sparkled like the sun, able to warm her cold body through the night. But this was a thought for another, more private time. Even if Elsa would have loved to have someone keep her warm at night, despite the cold not bothering her. A short horse ride later, the platinum blonde-haired queen reached her destination, only to find the many resident trolls circling around something she couldn't quite see. The sound of her feet hitting the hard earth as she dismounted caused the trolls to turn and look in her direction. As the trolls disengaged their circle around whatever they were looking at on the ground, Elsa thought she could see what looked like gold lying on the ground behind them. "Welcome Queen Elsa," the elder troll, Pabby, greeted. "Greetings Pabby, king of the troll," Elsa replied in kind. "I had come to thank you and your clan for helping my family as much as you have in these past years," Elsa started as she once again looked behind the trolls at what she thought was a lump of gold before she noticed it had a badly burned orange cloth wrapped around the rest of it. "I had not intended to interrupt anything important for you." "It is alright my queen," Pabby said quickly to ensure that the ruler of the land would not misunderstand. "We were merely checking on the one who arrived just moments ago," the aging troll said, as many of the trolls moved so Elsa could get a better look at the lump. What she thought was gold had actually been the bright yellow hair of a young man who was covered in the burnt remains of what used to be an orange jacket. Every couple of seconds or so his body would spasm and shake as he lay on the hard ground. The moss that was ever present in the troll's domain had been scorched around where the man lay, as heat seemed to radiate from his body. As Elsa drew closer to the man, she found herself subconsciously using her own magic to keep herself cool as she noticed the haze caused by the heated air around him. "What's wrong with him?" Elsa asked while she kneeled over him as her magic protected her from the heat. "We are not sure," Pabby said, moving to stand next to the queen as his rock body protected him from the heat as well. "He appeared in the ancient circle as if someone had summoned him, but when we gathered around him he was already like this." Elsa tentatively reached down and felt her fellow blonde's bare forehead to check his temperature the same way her own mother had done to her. Even with the ice that now covered her hand, protecting it from being burned, Elsa could feel the heat from the man's skin slowly begin to fill her. What surprised both of them the most was that the young man gave his first sign of life as he moved his body closer to Elsa when he felt her ice-covered hand touch his brow. When Elsa looked towards the Troll King for an explanation, he could only shake his head in sorrow. "I can sense a kind of magic inside him that burns him from the inside out. It is his need to be cooled down that draws him towards you." When Pabby finished speaking, Elsa looked back towards the suffering man. With a quick flick of her hand, the blonde was raised from the ground on a bed of solid ice, with a thick sheet of frost covered him. After a few seconds had passed, he stopped shaking and seemed to fall into a restful sleep within his frozen confines. With the man now comfortable, Elsa turned towards Pabby again with the hope that he could help the boy. "You said magic was what was hurting him, so can you just remove it like you did with my sister 14 years ago?" the queen questioned as she sat on the bed of ice. "I cannot, your majesty," the elder troll said in a morose tone. "The same magic that now harms him is also a part of him, and I can no more remove it than I can remove the magic you were born with from yourself." With each word that was spoken, Elsa's face grew more solemn as she turned to look at boy and saw a soft smile had replaced the anguish-filled grimace that had previously marred his face. It was at that moment that she noticed the thin lines on each of his cheeks that looked remarkably like whiskers. Elsa felt a blush appear on her own cheeks at the thought of how cute he looked. If Pabby hadn't started talking again, she might have started touching the marks to see if they were real. "Do not worry, Queen Elsa, I can sense that his own magic is also trying to heal him. It will however take time that he may not have with how hot his body is." Elsa had to stifle another gasp at the troll's words. "However, I believe that I see how we can keep him alive while he recovers. You, Queen Elsa, must take him with you back to your castle and keep his body cold with your magic just as you have done here. If you don't, his body will destroy itself before he can heal." Elsa agreed immediately to the request. Mainly because she would never turn away someone she could help, but she also felt that she had to take the man with her. No matter how hard she tried, every time she looked at his smiling face as he lay on the icy bed just brought a smile to her own lips. Elsa entertained the thought that this boy might have the most contagious smile she had ever seen. With a flick of her wrist, Elsa conjured a set of ice skies below the bed, turning it into a makeshift sled. Seeing what her plan was, many of the trolls that had been standing around watching started to move forward and attach the newly made sled to the horse that the queen had arrived on. Elsa could only stand back as the trolls quickly and effectively wrapped ropes between the horse's harness and the bed of ice. A hand pulling on her dress alerted her to Pabi once more wishing to talk with her while his people industriously worked. I do not know how he came to be here, but I feel that it is no coincidence that you, the one person that can save him, arrived only minutes after he appeared. I only ask that while you tend to him that you also try and befriend him yourself. I will King Pabi, Elsa said as she checked that the ice sled was secured to her horse. You said you were unsure of where he came from, so I can only imagine that he is not from around Arendelle. I am sure he would be most appreciative to have a friend while he is here. Finding the sled firmly secured, Elsa mounted her horse and said her goodbyes to the trolls before making her return home. Anna and her boyfriend Kristoff were speechless. They had returned from their picnic together only to hear that Elsa had gone off to the Valley of the Living Rock to visit Kristoff's friend's family. And now here they were standing by the gate Elsa would return through only to see her horse pulling a sled made of ice. While it wasn't odd for Elsa to create ice structures, it was odd for her to pull them anywhere instead of just create the structure where she wanted it. What was really strange though was when one of the guards called down that there was a person inside the sled. For the queen to bring someone into town was never unheard of in their history, but for this person to be able to stand Elsa's ice was possibly the oddest part. Within a few short minutes Elsa arrived at the gates where her sister and Kristoff waiting, and by the time Elsa had dismounted her horse Gerda and Kai had arrived. I will explain everything when we have time, Elsa said before anyone else could speak. Kai, please go and gather some soldiers who can carry this boy into the castle, Elsa ordered to Kai, and tell them to wear gloves and long-sleeved shirts for protection, she yelled after him while he ran off to gather the men. Elsa turned towards Gerda, asking if her old room was still empty. After a few seconds of thought the elderly maid answered affirmative, but that it was still designed to withstand cold temperatures. That is perfect, Gerda. Please have the servants remove my old bed from the room and give it a quick cleaning for our guest. Elsa had already turned around and returned to the side of the ice sled by the time Gerda acknowledged her order. Anna and Kristoff followed the queen over to the sled and for the first time got to look at the man that could sleep on ice. The young man's bright golden hair shone out against the clear ice of his bed. His body was covered in a thin sheet made of frost. When Elsa pulled the sheet down to check on him, Anna, Kristoff and Elsa were all amazed at what they saw. Where once the blonde had obviously been sleeping on solid ice, he was now sleeping inside a bowl filled with water from the ice that his body heat had melted. That is one hot guy, Elsa's sister Anna said before quickly realizing that out of context, that might sound weird to her boyfriend who was standing beside her. Not that he's hot or anything. I mean he is hot, but not in an attractive way, just a melting kind of way, Anna said, trying to clear up any misunderstanding while she waved her arms about frantically. Fortunately for Anna, Kristoff was too busy mourning over the loss of the perfectly clear ice Elsa had made to notice his girlfriend slip up. By the time Anna had calmed down and was able to calm Kristoff down as well, Kai had returned with several guards strong enough to carry the young man. Elsa quickly began guiding the soldiers, ordering them to keep the man wrapped in the blanket of frost while keeping their metal gauntlets on to protect them. From what they were unsure, but soon enough the guards carrying their cargo towards their queen's old bedroom. Once they reached the room, Elsa began creating another bed for her fellow blonde, who seemed to at least be content, so Elsa took her time in crafting his new resting place. Instead of creating her usual ice that was clear enough it could be used for windows, Elsa packed as much ice as she could into the simple bed to prevent the bed from melting like the sled did earlier. When the bed was done the soldiers placed him down before leaving to returning to their posts, while Kai left to continue his duties as Elsa, Anna, Kristoff and Gerda stayed to watch over the unconscious stranger. Now all we need to do is prop him up while I remove his clothes, Elsa absent-mindedly commented out loud. And that was not the next comment anyone was expecting from the queen in regards to the unconscious stranger. We laid a guy down on a bed of ice and you want to remove his clothes? Kristoff asked, shifting his gaze between the two blondes. I only meant his jacket and shirt, Elsa said quickly. Your Majesty, are you sure it is wise to remove any of his clothing? Gerda asked. Yes, for his health he must be made as cool as possible. His cloths are also ruined so they need to be removed either way, Elsa said in the steadiest voice she could manage, now that it had been pointed out that she and the others in the room would be removing the cloths of the admittedly attractive boy. Surely it would be better for one of the male servants to remove his clothes, Your Majesty, Gerda suggested. No. I'm the only one who can touch him, Elsa said with more force in her voice than she would have liked, but she couldn't take the chance of someone getting burned by the superheated boy. However, because she had yet to explain his condition to everyone, they thought that she was just being possessive. Anna made a mental note to tease Elsa about her new crush later. Alright fine, I'll lift him, you pull his jacket off, Kristoff said to Elsa. Make sure you're wearing your gloves, Elsa called out to him. You sure you don't have a thing about dirt? Kristoff asked as he pulled his gloves on. I don't. You just need to be careful with him, Elsa said with some slight annoyance in her voice. Anna chuckling behind Kristoff was not helping. His gloves in place, Kristoff forced his fellow blonde into a sitting position as his thick gloves unknowingly protected him from the heat. Once the mystery man was in a sitting position with Kristoff's hands on his left side, Elsa began to remove his ruined jacket from the right, exposing his mesh shirt. When the right side of his jacket off, she moved to the left as Kristoff shifted his hold to help her remove the cloth. When his jacket was off, Elsa folded it on the foot of the ice bed to cool off before she grabbed the bottom of his mesh shirt and pulled up. Kristoff adjusting his grip from on top of the shirt and put his gloved hands onto the other man's bare back, where he thought he could feel something hot but shrugged it off as a trick of his mind. Elsa, meanwhile, was lost in her own world as her bare fingers traced against the back of her fellow blonde's broad naked shoulders while she held his shirt. As she was getting the shirt over his pecs, she was pulled out of her thoughts by a loud gasp from both Kristoff and Anna. Leaving the mostly pulled off shirt where it was, Elsa looked towards the man's back where the other two were staring. The discolored skin of a jagged scar resting below his shoulder blade over his heart caused Gerda to turn away and Elsa to literally freeze to the floor as her powers reacted to the jarring sight. Yet she could feel that the fist-sized scar was not the end of it, and with trembling fingers she turned and finished pulling his shirt off, revealing another identical scar on his chest. Trying to retain as much composure as possible, Elsa motioned for Kristoff to lay the blonde down before she covered him with a sheet of ice and a blanket of snow. As his face lost some of its redness, Elsa sighed in relief that the boy's life was now safe. Picking up the ruined jacket, she turned towards Gerda and deciding to distract the older women. Gerda, please take this jacket and see if it's salvageable. Of course, your majesty, Gerda said as she took the tattered piece of cloth and retreating from the room. Once the elderly maid was gone, the room descended into a peaceful quiet. After several minutes had passed, it was Anna who broke the silence between the three as she took a closer look at the other boy. So, Elsa, what's the story with this guy? I'm not really sure myself. It was the trolls who found him, Elsa responded to her sister. The trolls found him? Kristoff questioned. Yes, when I went to thank them earlier, they were surrounding him, she said, indicating towards the unconscious blonde. When I asked why he was there, King Pabbie said that he had just appeared before I showed up. I find it hard to believe that he could just appear, and not even Grandpabbie knows where he came from, Kristoff said with some skepticism. Before Elsa could respond, Anna, who had been staring at the unconscious boy, reached her hand out toward his face to check if his whiskers were real. As the redeeded princess's fingers touched the marks on his cheek, she recoiled her hand and screamed, drawing everyone's attention. Anna, both Elsa and Kristoff yelled as they rushed to her side while she held onto her hand. When she released her hand, the two could see that her fingers had been burnt and were now painful red. Seeing the burn, Elsa quickly grabbed her sister's hand and began to course her magic across the burnt fingers, relieving much of the pain and pulling the heat out. After a short time, Elsa pulled her hand away to reveal that her powers had been able to pull the heat out of Anna's fingers, leaving the digit sore, but otherwise fine. Her sister's fingers partially healed and being doted over by Kristoff, Elsa turned toward the bed. She noted that the ice bed was cold enough that the superheated blonde had finally stopped radiating heat, leaving Anna with no warning of the danger until it was too late. Knowing her sister was fine, Elsa allowed herself a soft smile at the knowledge that her methods were indeed helping to keep the boy alive. Looking to see that Kristoff and Anna had calmed down from the burnt finger scare and were now staring at the other blonde with some fear. Elsa called for their attention and began to explain what was going on. I'm sorry that you got hurt, Anna, but I did warn you that I am the only one who can touch him without gloves, Elsa said, trying not to be too reprimanding towards her still naive younger sister, but still convey that she was worried about her. As you've noticed, his skin temperature is high enough to burn the skin of most others. I can touch him because of my powers. Next time, could you give me an earlier warning, Elsa? Anna said as she rested within her boyfriend's arms. I'm sorry, Anna, I should have told you earlier, but I had to make sure he was safe first. When I first saw him, King Pabbie said that there was a magic inside him causing the heat and that it would kill him if he wasn't kept cooled, Elsa said. Wait, so Grandpabbie said he had a magic inside him that was killing him, so why didn't he just remove it? Kristoff asked, perplexed how any of the trolls that raised him and Sven could just leave an injured person as they were. According to Pabbie, he was born with his magic just like I was, so he couldn't remove it. He also said that while the magic was hurting him, it was also trying to heal him at the same time. Seeing the look of wonder that now replaced the look of fear the other two were giving the young man, Elsa stayed silent for a few minutes before she continued. Pabbie thinks that he will heal on his own, but until then he needs to be kept cool so he can heal. So he asked that I bring him with me to the castle so that I can watch over him until he is fully recovered. So you bring a guy home and we keep him on ice until he gets better, right? Anna said as she once more moved to look at the strange blonde. That's about it, but I have to ask what made you touch him in the first place? Elsa asked as she also moved closer towards the unconscious man. Oh, I was just curious if his whiskers were real. I noticed those too, but didn't get a chance to see if they were real, Elsa said, as her sister pulled herself out of Kristoff's hug and moved next to the blonde's bed. Once Anna was next to her, Elsa reached out her hand and gently placed her fingers against the blonde's cheek before slowly rubbing his whiskers marks. What happened next confused the room's conscious occupants as a dull rumble resonated throughout the room, startling everyone as Anna moved back next to her boyfriend. Eventually the sound disappeared and Elsa, who had stopped rubbing the blonde's whiskers, looked at the boy and began to wonder. Tentatively Elsa dragged her fingers against the blonde's marked cheek. Almost instantly the rumbling sounded again, but this time prepared for it, Elsa didn't stop rubbing her fellow blonde's face. In what she correctly guessed as related, the noise didn't stop this time. Slowly leaning forward, Elsa brought her ear closer to the blonde's chest, where she noticed the sound was coming from. In one quick movement Elsa pulled herself away from the boy and stifled a laugh at what she had discovered. Taking a moment to compose herself, Elsa turned to look at the room's other two occupants, who only looked on with curious stares. "The purrs," was all she said before returning to stroking the boy's whiskers and bringing the rumbling purr back. Guided by their curiosity, Anna and Kristoff both once again moved closer to the purring human as they watched the queen of their country amuse herself by seeing if she could get him to purr any differently by changing her petting technique. It was only when Kristoff spoke that the sisters were pulled from their trance of wonderment. "You know, people call me unmanly because of my blonde hair, but not only is he blonde, he also purrs like a cat." The response to Kristoff's statement was an elbow to the gut thanks to his girlfriend and her sister. "Well, if you're going to be like that, I should probably go. You coming, Anna?" Before her sister could say anything, Elsa decided to intervene. "Go ahead, Anna, have your hand properly looked at and tell the staff about him so they don't make the same mistake you did. I'm going to wait here for a little bit to make sure that he's fine." Nodding to her sister, Anna left the room with her boyfriend. Once alone, Elsa pulled a chair towards the bed and began to wait. With only the quiet breathing of the blonde and an occasional purr as Elsa would rub his cheek, the queen of Arendelle was left alone again. Left with nothing but her thoughts, dreams, and an unconscious man. Break. When trained ninjas become conscious, the first thing they do is try and determine their surroundings to see if they're in any danger. When Naruto Uzumaki wakes up, he yawns loudly, sits up, and stretches out his arms to give any would-be assassins an easier shot. Naruto has never been too worried about safety, being that he could heal instantly from most wounds. So when he woke up in a bed made out of ice that wasn't cold for him, and having no memory of how he got there, Naruto was a bit confused. He remembered Kurama saying something about how they had to leave so he could live, but that was it. The blonde ninja was interrupted from trying to remember what happened when he felt something soft push into the side of his leg. When he looked down, he saw a head of almost white blonde hair resting on the side of his ice bed, while the rest of the bent-over slender feminine body could be seen sitting in a chair next to the bed. Whoever she was, she had apparently fallen asleep while waiting for him to wake up and had bumped her head into his leg when she shifted. Deciding to wake up the person who had been assigned to take care of him, or at least get her up from the uncomfortable position, Naruto began poking the girl in the head until she began to stir. The first thing the strange woman did was sit back against the chair and try to stretch her back. When she seemed slightly more comfortable, she looked towards the thing that had woken her up and let out a light gasp that Naruto had woken up. And then she started talking in a language that Naruto didn't understand. "I'm so glad you're awake, I hope you're comfortable," the beautiful woman said in some foreign language. Naruto, having no clue what had just been said, could only ask what. The woman looked slightly lost before starting to say more incomprehensible words. "What was that? I didn't hear you." "I've got no idea what you're saying, lady," Naruto said as he moved to sit against a headboard. "You speak a different language, don't you?" the lady said in her weird language. However, before Naruto could say anything, she stood up from her chair before she grasped at her back in pain. Before she could fall over from the sudden shock of pain, Naruto had already moved to the side of the bed and caught her. With the woman in his arms, Naruto noticed that she was still holding her back to try and ease some of the pain. So Naruto, never being one to turn away from helping someone, placed his hand over the small of her back and began to use a simple massage technique he learned at one of the many clubs Jiraiya dragged him to, combined with a medical ninjutsu that Tsunade had pounded in his head just for emergencies. Break. Elsa was mortified. Not only had she fallen asleep in a horrible position, but now she was making a fool of herself in front of the man she had promised to help. And now he was holding her up after she had almost fallen due to her sore back. She was used to soft mattresses and feather pillows, not bent over in a chair. So it was a great surprise when she felt the boy's hand on the lower part of her back and was just about to tell him to move it, whether he would understood it or not, but stopped when she felt a soothing warmth wash over her entire body. Where once her back had been sore, now her entire body felt like it had just emerged from a hot relaxing bath. It was all she could do to keep a slight coo of pleasure silent, as even pain she had long ago gotten used to vanished under the warmth of whatever this stranger was doing. When all of the pain had passed from her body, Elsa stood up from the boy's hold and looked down at him while he continued to sit on the bed. Clearing her throat to make sure that she had the boy's full attention, she began to speak slowly and precisely so that hopefully her fellow blonde might understand. "Thank you." Short sentences would probably be best for now, Elsa decided as she watched the boy. At first he seemed to think over the words before he started moving his jaw, and finally he moved his lips and began to speak sense for the first time. "Thank you." Or so Elsa had hoped. At least the words were recognizable, Elsa thought. "Thank you," Elsa said, putting emphasis on each part of the words, hoping that the boy would parrot them back. "Thank you," he managed to say, stumbling over the words, but there was no doubt that he had indeed said them correctly. Elsa smiled as the boy continued to say the simple sentence a few more times before he too began to smile along with her. His was a large toothy smile that seemed to encompass his entire face, while hers was a bit more subdued but no less radiant. Once again clearing her throat to bring the boy's attention back towards her, she tried for another word that he would need to know, namely her name. Pointing towards herself, she said her name slowly and with as much care as she could muster, before saying it again at the correct speed a few seconds later. Expecting him to parrot it back like he had done earlier, she was not prepared for when he once more smiled broadly and pointing at himself promptly said Naruto. While she had not thought that he would do such a thing, Elsa was pleasantly surprised that the boy had thought to do introductions. So taking her time, she tried to repeat the same sounds he made while saying his name. "Naruto," she seemed to have said his name correctly as he once again began smiling and nodded his head rapidly at her success. Smiling softly, she took a few seconds to turn towards the clock on the wall, wondering what time it was. "Elsa?" the boy said, drawing her attention back towards him. Once she was looking at him again, he began to say her name again followed by his own, as his hands pointed towards both of them in correspondence with his words. As he kept speaking, Elsa got the feeling that he was more seeking acknowledgement that he was right instead of practicing. Nodding her head in agreement caused the Naruto to let out a loud yada before he began to talk quickly in whatever language he spoke and just didn't stop. Eventually Elsa found herself sitting in her chair again as she just listened to the foreign words. She may not understand any of them, but she didn't really need to. All that mattered for that short period of time was that Naruto, the boy she had promised to protect, was awake and, judging by the amount of energy he showed, well on his way to being fully recovered. It had been about a week since Naruto had woken up. The servants had been briefed by Anna not to touch him, and now that it was known why Elsa had brought him to the castle, many were accepting of him. The few who were more cautious about him were soon won over by his naturally charismatic personality. Soon he had met everyone in the castle with the exception of Olaf and Sven, who had disappeared, but those two wouldn't be hard to win over when they came back. In truth, the only problem with Naruto seemed to be that he spoke a different language. Most of the staff and linguists from the village had at one point or another tried to talk to him, but none of them knew anything he was saying. Whenever someone tried to communicate through gestures with him, they would be unable to follow his hyper and erratic movements that meant something to him but left others clueless. The only person that seemed to understand his gestures was Elsa, probably because she spent so much time around him. The queen had decided to watch over him due mostly to the fact that she was the only one who could touch him, and being that the doctors needed to touch him in order to check if he was healthy, did cause a problem. The only thing they could do was prescribed him bed rest until his fever went down, and Elsa volunteered to watch over him to begin with. And so the two blondes were left in the same room with little to do but run a country and try to learn about each other through the language barrier. And one of the first thing Elsa had learned about Naruto as a person was that he hated to be kept in bed. She had to spend the first day trying to keep him in bed. Whenever he was awake, he would try to make an escape. The first time he had simply stood up and tried to walk away, and Elsa had to forcibly push him back towards the bed until he figured out that she wanted him to stay in bed. A few attempts later and Naruto tried to escape in a way that had been quite funny for Elsa, as he tried to jump out the open window of the room to make his escape. However, Naruto quickly learned that it would be very difficult to escape from his frozen bed, as Elsa made his ice sheets come to life and trap him before he could make it to the window. That seemed to have at least slowed down his escape attempts. Mostly because ever since he had learned that she could control ice, he had become fascinated by her ability. When she first used it to stop him from leaving, he had looked surprised, and Elsa thought that he might become scared of her. But no, after only a minute he once again became animated and started talking in his foreign language. He had willing spent the next few days in his bed watching as she crafted sculptures out of ice and did other little tricks with her power. Over those few days he made several comments, none of which she could understand, but he would always use the word Haku-chan. Elsa thought given her powers that the word might mean ice where he was from, but often found that he said it like he was talking about someone. If it was a name, maybe this Haku-chan had a relation to ice like she did. The two of them would have a lot in common if they ever met. It was during her first display that Naruto figured out that his body was superheated. Apparently he was unable to tell what his skin temperature was and no one could tell him. So when Naruto tried to grab a piece of paper and it started to burn, he was naturally confused. Naruto spent the next several minutes trying to hold a piece of paper with little success. With all the smoldering paper, it was kind of amazing that Naruto didn't give up sooner. But eventually he decided to stop and return to using gestures to communicate. And after an entire week, only a few minutes ago did Naruto learn that Elsa was an important figure in the city. She had a meeting about a dispute between some of the merchants, and being that it was the middle of the day, she feared that if she left Naruto would try and escape. So she opted to have the meeting in Naruto's room. Through the use of the basic gestures the two had worked out to communicate, Elsa managed to get Naruto to quiet down. Convincing him that he needed to remain quiet for a little while was problematic, but doable in the end. With Naruto staying silent, Elsa signaled for the guards to allow the men into the room. Standing, she greeted the men who immediately bowed back to her in respect. Hearing a noise from Naruto, Elsa looked towards him only to see him smiling at her with that fox-like grin he would occasionally get. Turning away from him, Elsa began her meeting, hoping the Naruto would remain quiet. And he did in fact remain quiet. He never made a sound during the meeting. Thankfully it was a short meeting, and Elsa didn't need to worry about how long Naruto would remain silent. Once the merchants left, Elsa turned back towards Naruto and saw that he was still sitting in his bed smiling at her when he spoke. "Time." Elsa froze as Naruto said it. He had tried talking to her many times, but the words never held any real meaning for her. Yet what he had just spoken seemed to draw her to him. He hadn't said them in a particularly special way, but how the words seemed to be meant just for her brought a smile to her face. Pointing at herself, Elsa parroted back the strange words, causing Naruto to nod and began to weave his fingers around above his head. She was confused at first, but eventually figured out that he was trying to signifying a crown or headpiece. Figuring out what he meant, Elsa called for a servant to bring her tiara that she usually didn't wear and immediately put it on when it arrived. Doing a quick curtsy to try and convey her royal position, Elsa stood to the sound of Naruto clapping at her display. Looking at the broad smile on Naruto's face, it was all Elsa could do to keep from laughing and retain her royal demeanor. Wanting to continue the special moment the two of them were sharing, Elsa decided to reward Naruto for staying quiet during the meeting. So the Queen of Arendelle moved to her old dresser, where she grabbed a package that she had put earlier that day. Sitting in her chair by Naruto's bed, Elsa undid the string tying the paper bundle together before she pulled out her gifts for Naruto. When Jiraiya had told her that Naruto's jacket was beyond repair, Elsa wasn't too worried about the orange jacket's death. It wouldn't be until a few hours later that she had a wonderful thought. While Naruto's jacket was destroyed, it had been insulated enough that no one could feel his body heat through it. Calling for the royal tailor, Elsa gave instructions for her fellow blonde's clothes to be remade, but with an insulated non-flammable layer on the inside to protect others. At the tailor's suggestion, they added gloves and a vest filled with water that Naruto would wear under his jacket, and Elsa could freeze to keep him cooled under the warm clothing. The clothes had been finished the night before, and Naruto's temperature seemed to have gone down some. So Elsa thought that the clothes would make a wonderful gift to Naruto so he could get out of his bed and move around a little. First she pulled out his new jacket. She had asked the tailor to recreating the look of his old one, but had run into a problem or two. Mainly that he refused to make the colors that atrociously bright and orange, as he called it, so made it a darker burnt orange color instead. Elsa didn't mind the color that much though. So while the jacket didn't match his old one exactly, it did look very similar, and judging by the look in Naruto's eyes when he saw, it was close enough. She handed the jacket over to him and watched as he moved it around in his hands to look it over, taking in every detail. Soon enough he pulled the jacket on and started moving around wildly before Elsa caught his arm. She gave a slight tug at the back of his jacket to show him she wanted him to take it off, mostly so he could put the vest on when she got to it. Definitely not because she enjoyed looking at his naked muscular chest and had grown used to seeing it on a daily basis. Having gotten used to seeing that scar over his heart that showed just how tough he really was, even with that lovably goofy smile of his. With his jacket now gone, Elsa pulled the gloves out and handed them to Naruto. The tailor had made them with the same colored cloth as Naruto's jacket, which Naruto immediately showed he liked by putting them on. With the gloves on and fitting nicely, Elsa tore a piece of paper from the wrapping and physically put it in his hand to demonstrate that he wouldn't burn things while wearing them. What Elsa hadn't expecting to happen next was for Naruto to leap from the bed and wrap his arms around her in a hug while shouting the phrase she had taught him a week ago, "Thank you." Surprised at first that she was being hugged, Elsa soon became more surprised that she was comfortable being hugged. Naruto pulling her into his warm body as her normally cold skin flushed against his bare chest. Holding her protectively with his strong arms as if his entire body was a blanket meant just to be wrapped around her from. She was content for those seconds, being held against Naruto's naked chest as her own showing skin brushed up against it and there was the wake-up call she needed. Inside the comfort of the hug, Elsa had forgotten that Naruto radiated heat and melted anything he touched. Especially if it was made out of ice like his bed or even her dress that now had a few holes in it, showing off her flawless skin. Quickly disengaging from the hug and turning around in her chair to hide and repair the holes in her dress, she turned her head and tried to give her most reassuring smile to calm Naruto, who looked very confused at her actions. Luckily he seemed to have not seen anything. With her dress presentable again, Elsa turned and began to hand him the rest of his new clothes, demonstrating to the best of her abilities that the vest was meant to be worn beneath his jacket and keep him cool. With his gift spread out on the bed, Elsa stood and tried to motion for him to get dressed as she left the room to give him some privacy. She was used to only seeing his top half naked, not all of him. Standing outside the room, she stood close to the door in order to hear if Naruto tried to do anything. Thankfully it was only a minute later when she heard the door begin to open. Break. Naruto was happy to be getting out of his icy bed and quickly began to get dressed in his awesome new orange clothes. He had woken up in that bed a week ago and had been trapped there ever since, only being allowed to go to the bathroom. Thankfully Elsa had been there to keep him company, even if she was the one who was keeping him there. When he woke up he felt fine, if a bit tired, but he couldn't feel anything wrong. He tried to talk with Kurama to see if whatever it had done worked, but couldn't seem to contact the demon. Having no real reason to believe that he needed to be in bed, he tried to leave. Only to have Elsa push him back into bed. Eventually he tried the window and again Elsa stopped him, but this time she used her control over ice. At first he thought that Haku had been reincarnated, but eventually figured out that Elsa just had the same powers. Wondering if she was using chakra, he grabbed a piece of paper to show his use of wind chakra to cut it. However, what surprised him was that instead of the paper slicing cleanly down the middle, it started to burn. Really confused due to his lack of a fire nature, Naruto tried again only to get the same result. So he tried again, but this time didn't use any chakra when he picked up the paper, and again it burned. Another attempt later and Naruto finally figured out that it wasn't his chakra that was hot, it was him. A few seconds of thought brought Naruto to the conclusion that he was being kept in the ice bed to keep him cool, and Elsa was watching over him because she could touch him due to her ice powers. His theory was proven when he met several other people, including who he thought was Elsa's sister, but none of them would shake his hand or come close to him. The only one who did shake his hand was another guy with blonde hair and a hard-to-pronounce name, but he wore gloves when he did. Knowing that he was superheated and therefore a danger to others and not being able to contact Kurama, Naruto resigned himself to just sitting in his bed. Thankfully Elsa was around and was fun to be around. Even though he couldn't understand her, he still had fun talking with her and trying to learn her language. He only knew about a dozen words and mostly communicated with Elsa through gestures, but he was happy. Elsa would come by early in the morning and they would talk for as much as they could before Elsa would move over to the desk at the far wall and do paperwork. That was what really shocked Naruto. He originally wasn't sure why she was doing paperwork, but now he knew she was some kind of ruler like the old man or Bachan. He figured she must be a princess or daimyo due to the people from earlier acting like she was. So he called her a princess. And if she really was a princess, that would explain why she seemed nervous during the first few days she stayed with him. It was only little things like looking towards the door constantly or peering out the window. Naruto had originally thought that she just didn't want to be there and even tried to tell her if she was uncomfortable that she could leave. But he had once again forgotten about the language barrier. Now that he knew she was a princess, he figured that she was just worried that someone would need her help and she would be busy with him, and he really admired that about her. Even though she must have been busy with her people, she still took the job of watching over him very seriously. She just seemed to give it her all with everything she did, and Naruto really liked that about her. Pulling his gloves back on his hands and leaving his jacket unzipped to keep him cool, Naruto headed out. Opening the door, he was greeted by a smiling Elsa who dragged her eyes across his new clothes. She moved to stand beside him and began what he assumed would be a tour of the house. Or castle, as he soon found out. Naruto followed Elsa down the stairs and through several hallways until they reached a large stone room that had several people running around in it. Understanding it was a kitchen, Elsa pulled him over to a side table and both of them sat down. She said something to one of the servants, who brought her a plate of dumplings and then gestured to him, which he took as being his turn to order. Naruto of course asked for the greatest food known to anyone or anything, ramen. What he got was a blank stare. After a few seconds he remembered that he wasn't home and probably wouldn't have the same foods. So he tried to show what Raymond was with his hands, making waving motions with his fingers in the hope that he could imitate the look of Raymond. Deciding that he couldn't match the same level of awesome as Raymond with his fingers, Naruto stood up and began to walk around for some himself. After several minutes of fumbling with handles due to his gloves and opening every cabinet and drawer inside a far pantry, Naruto found some noodles. They didn't look like the ramen noodles he was used to, but they at least smelled similar, so he pulled them out and placed them in a bowl he had picked up. Moving on, Naruto followed his nose to a stove where several pots of broth were cooking. Humming to one near the middle, Naruto pointed at it so a chef would add it to his bowl. Steaming bowl of beef broth and noodles in hand, Naruto returned to his seat across from Elsa and began the task of waiting for the noodles to cook, unaware that he was the center of conversation for those in the kitchen. When he thought that 3 minutes were up, Naruto began to eat. It was a bit difficult to eat without chopsticks like he was used to, but over the week Elsa had been teaching him how to use a fork and he thought he was doing pretty well. Finishing his bowl of not quite godly but more demi-godly noodles, Naruto put the bowl down and turned to thank the chefs. Seeing that Elsa had finished her dumplings and was just watching him by this point, Naruto could only blush and scratch at the back of his head in embarrassment. While he was used to eating with a few girls, like Sakura, he wasn't used to a girl just watching him. Especially if her lips were in that soft smile she had when she was just content to watch him. Naruto gave his bowl to the chef so it could be cleaned. He smiled at Elsa, who smiled back and stood from her chair in that graceful manner she always had and beckoned for him to follow. Standing to follow, Naruto headed out the door they entered through as Elsa stopped to talk with one of the cooks for a moment. While waiting for Elsa to finish, Naruto looked down the hall and saw something weird. Curiosity getting the better of him, Naruto walked over to see what it was and why it seemed to be moving. Reaching the end of the corridor and now close enough to touch it, Naruto was able to identify the large furry brown mass as the back end of an animal. Looking around the corner, what he saw was some deer-like creature. Naruto had experience with deer due to his friendship with Shikamaru, but what he was looking at was much hairier than other deer and seemed to be crossed with a dog, if the lolling tongue was any indication. It seemed to look around for something before it grunted and walked farther down the hall. When the thing had walked around another corner farther down the hall, Naruto turned to look up the hall he was in to see Elsa moving towards him. Motioning for her to stand beside him, he pointed to where the strange deer had been and then held his hands above his head with his fingers splayed to symbolize antlers. Elsa chuckled into her hands as she seemed to understand what he meant and even gave him the word Sven for the deer thing. Whether it was the thing's species or its name, Naruto wasn't sure. Whatever it was, the rest of the tour was spent with Naruto watching out for Sven. Before anything else could happen though, Elsa grabbed his hand and pulled him farther down the hall they were in, towards a large room full of paintings. Having never really appreciated art that much, Naruto found the paintings boring, but he did enjoy the architecture of the castle as the tour progressed. It had so many nooks and crannies that he, or others, could hide in. He investigated all of them to make sure they were safe. While not expecting a full-on invasion, he wanted to make sure the home of his new friend was secure for her. And so he didn't insult Elsa by scrutinizing her defenses. Naruto put forth his best effort to be polite and not jump away while she was looking at or talking to him. This seemed acceptable to Elsa, or she at least didn't indicate otherwise, so Naruto continued his search for hiding spots. And it was in one of these spots that Naruto saw another strange sight. Elsa had been called over by one of the older maids and had moved to one side of the entrance hall she had been showing him. Naruto took the chance and jumped up to a windowsill near the ceiling. Seeing that Elsa was still in the same place, Naruto looked around the room and saw something white on the other side of the hall from his friend. And while strange this time, Naruto knew what it was, or at least all the parts of what it was. It was a small mound of shaped snow with twig arms and a carrot nose that was being followed around by a floating cloud that was constantly snowing on it. While Naruto had seen many snowmen due to his travels, they weren't seen that often in Konoha due to the hot weather. And they didn't have clouds following them or move themselves, but Naruto had honestly seen weirder. An army of moving stone statues to start with. Figuring that the moving snowman might be connected to his new friend who could control snow, Naruto jumped down from his perch to meet the strange snowman. Now that he was closer, Naruto could see that it was really small and looked like it had been designed by a child. Its facial features defied gravity and its arms moved without joints. It truly was a marvelous sight, and if it was Elsa's doing, it was a large testament to her power. And then the snowman talked. Naruto was prepared for an enthusiastic wave or something. Not for the thing to start screaming words and running at him. Most of what it said was lost on Naruto, who was only able to make the words Sven out, but what truly mattered was that it was running at him. When it was right in front of him, the snowman stopped running and started jumping, so Naruto decided that he should play it safe when dealing with the snowman. by getting it as far away from him as possible. Break. What Elsa thought would be a simple tour soon turned into a whirlwind of motion and excitement as she tried to follow Naruto around her home. She had started off by pulled him down to the kitchen so that the two of them could have an afternoon snack and possibly to see what food he liked. After ordering herself to show her intent, Naruto spent several minutes trying to order something called ramen. He started off by saying the word every few seconds in his rapid speech before trying to show what he wanted. When he decided that failed, he went around the kitchen looking for it himself before finally finding some noodles that seemed to be what he was looking for. After adding some soup broth to the noodles, waiting a few minutes, and ignored all of the chefs talking about the strange food he had made, he proceeded to eat the odd concoction. He seemed to enjoy it greatly with how fast he was trying to eat it. And given how bad he was at using a fork, it was impressive. At least he was using a fork when compared to earlier this week when she had considered spoon feeding him due to his lack of knowledge about eating utensils. Pretty soon Naruto had finished his meal and passed the bowl to a chef to wash. She stood and Naruto followed her out of the room, but before she left she turned towards one of the chefs and asked that he try and recreate the noodle and broth concoction that Naruto made. Both because Naruto enjoyed it and because she wanted to try some. When she and the chef had finished talking, she turned to look towards where Naruto was, only to find him at the end of the hall looking paranoid. When he saw her, he waved her over as he began pointing down a side hall and then held his hands over his in the vague shape of antlers. Of course, the only thing he could be referring to had to be Sven, due mostly to the fact that Elsa preferred that wild animals not roam the halls of her castle. So unless a wild reindeer had found its way inside, she could only guess that he had just seen the lovable Sven, who Naruto hadn't met yet. Which might explain his mild panic attack regarding the appearance of the large animal. Chuckling at the situation of being unable to calm Naruto's worries over the reindeer due to the language barrier, Elsa told Naruto that the reindeer's name was Sven. Mostly so that Naruto would know that Sven was a friend and hopefully wouldn't freak out the next time he saw him. Feeling confident that Naruto was calmed down, Elsa grabbed his hand and pulled him towards the room full of paintings that Anna would spend her time in when she wasn't hanging around Kristoff. Due to Anna spending quite a lot of time with the paintings in her youth, she could tell anyone almost all of the history behind the different portraits and images. Elsa could not, having spent most of her adolescence in parental and self-imposed isolation. Not that she could tell Naruto anything about the paintings, even if she had known anything. No, her reasoning her bringing him to this room in particular was to try and learn Naruto's language, or teach him hers. She was hoping that with the many paintings she would be able to point at a picture, say the word, and slowly teach him that way. And if not, she could see if he recognized any of the foreign paintings and might show where he's from. Once they entered the room, Elsa let go of Naruto's hand and moved towards one of the paintings, expecting him to follow. So when she reached the painting she wanted and turned towards Naruto, she was mildly shocked to find him missing. She half expected him to be by the door looking for Sven, but he wasn't. In fact, he wasn't anywhere in the room that she could see. For a full minute, Elsa ran around the room looking for the disappearing blonde. Keep her eyes open for any sign of his blonde hair or orange clothes while straining her ears for the sound of his voice. It was while her head was still down, after having looked under a couch, that she saw a shadow stretched across the floor. Following the shadow towards one of the many large windows near the ceiling of the room, she was greeted by the silhouetted form of Naruto, who was staring out the window into the outside world. Not knowing how he had managed to get up to the window with no ladder and only having turned away from him for all of 5 seconds, Elsa was left speechless. Completely at a loss for words. Forced to just stand in the middle of the room looking skywards at her fellow blonde, engulfed in the sun's light, as if he was the source of the bright glow. And for a scant second, Elsa thought she could see golden flames rising off Naruto's form. What Elsa would later recount as having felt like spending several hours watching her friend was in fact only a few minutes. Elsa herself would have probably continued to stare for longer if the object of her gaze himself hadn't moved, breaking the moment. Finding himself stared at, Naruto turned sideways towards Elsa and grinned as the sun now illuminated his whiskered visage. She could only give a soft wave as Naruto began smiling at her like he wasn't in a windowsill on the equivalent of the 3rd story. She did have to stop waving in favor of taking a step back when Naruto jumped to her complete disbelief. For Elsa thought that Naruto would be stuck up there until a ladder could be brought to get him down. Naruto just seemed to take a step off the edge and land in front of her in a low crouch before standing straight with no sign of strain or fear. Instead, he just smiled at her before talking in his rapid and excited manner, presumably about the view, until he just stopped and smiled at her. With nothing else to do, she just smiled back, grabbed his hand to ensure that he wouldn't run off on her again, and continued their walk around the house. Her idea of teaching him not forgotten, but pushed to the side until later. Hopefully when he would stop surprising her, or at the very least not scare her like he just did. The rest of the tour had Elsa showing Naruto around the castle. literally by the hand to make sure that he was following. Elsa had quickly learned that if she turned her back on Naruto or let go of his hand in any room, he would disappear. However, if she was looking at him or holding his hand, he would follow her around and wait semi-patiently for her. She wasn't sure whether he went off to explore when she wasn't looking at him, to keep his secret on how he got to the higher places, or he stayed around in case she was going to talk gesture with him. It only took seeing that large good-hearted smile of his to make her believe it was more the second option. Sometime after Naruto's third disappearance, Elsa began to make a game of trying to find him. She would bring him to one of the many rooms, look around with him, and then let him free for several seconds before she would try to find him. Which was not as easy as she first thought it was going to be. Where she had figured it would take Naruto a little bit of time to get up to one of the higher spots that he seemed to favor, and he would then stay there. Instead, he seemed to scope out the entire room and would only stop if Elsa could find him before he finished. In one of the smaller rooms, Elsa turned around to find Naruto standing almost exactly where he was before. The only thing different was the ball in his hand. A ball that she remembered Anna playing with when she was younger and had accidentally bounced too hard against a wall and had gotten it stuck in the rafters. Where it had remained ever since because no one could reach it, so Anna had just been given another ball. Elsa tentatively looked up towards where the ball usually lived, only to find it missing from its home for the past couple of years. Looking at him, Elsa couldn't help but smile at his simple act of charity and friendship. For as weird and strange as he was, to Elsa, it was the simple act of Naruto retrieving a lost ball that cemented how kind and nice a man he was. And if the two of them weren't friends before, Elsa was determined that they were now. And as his friend, she was going to make sure that he survived his problem and was helped out in this world he was unfamiliar with. Holding the old dusty ball in one hand to personally give to Anna later and dragging Naruto along with her other hand, Elsa began the walk back to her old room that Naruto now lived in. Her intent was to take him from the entrance hall, where everything was connected, to his room so he could hopefully learn his own way to his room. However, Jiraiya called out to her when they were just about to reach the stairs. Not really having much of a choice, Elsa left Naruto to explore possibly the largest room in the castle. While Elsa couldn't really imagine what could go wrong in the large, mostly empty room, she just felt worried for some reason. Maybe it was woman's intuition. Or maybe it was the sound of Olaf yelling as he ran toward someone new to him and who didn't know about him. "Hi, I'm Olaf and I like warm hugs. You must be the guy Kristoff mentioned. You probably met him, but you might not know who he is because he's sometimes called Sven. I mean, it's really rare, and while it's convenient, no one ever really bothered to explain why he's called that. Don't you think that's weird? 'Cause I do." Throughout Olaf's mini rant, Elsa could feel her heart sink at the thought of what Naruto might do about the snowman, who happened to be just as hyper as he was. If Naruto freaked out over Sven because no one was around to tell him the reindeer was a friend, she did not want to know how he would react to the walking pile of snow by himself. Unfortunately, she got her answer a second later when Olaf's separated head and body flew past her and Jiraiya before hitting the far wall. Wow. That was intense, Elsa could hear Olaf exclaim as he slid down the wall, showing that he was okay. Now she just had to make sure Naruto was fine. Well, maybe fine wasn't the word she wanted Naruto to be. In truth, she would have much preferred to have him calm at that moment. Sadly, while Naruto was fine, he wasn't calm. So Naruto's head could be seen from behind the stairs, yelling words that sounded suspiciously like they might be swears in his language. Hoping that her presence and calm demeanor in the situation would help to calm him down, Elsa moved closer towards her friend. Mentally preparing herself for how she was going to deal with her hyper-blonde friend, who wasn't a fan of her hyper-snowman friend. Who had scraped himself off the wall and was now happily dancing around again. Prompting more words from Naruto, probably wondering why Olaf was fine. This might take a while to explain. Oh, the headache Elsa had. It had only been a few minutes, but between Olaf's happy yelling and trying to coax Naruto down from the rafters, it was getting hard to keep calm. As she had been approaching the blonde behind the stairs to try to calm him down, Elsa made the mistake of taking her eyes off Naruto and turning towards Olaf and asked him to keep quiet while she calmed her other friend, who took the chance to disappear. Not like he did the other times where he would move to a new part of the room. This time he just vanished. He had even stopped yelling, making it even harder to tell where he was. The only time he was seen was if she caught sight of his hair or clothes when he moved from one rafter to another. So far, Elsa had been able to see him in 5 different spots within 2 minutes. Unfortunately, with all the commotion that was being caused, it seemed that almost everyone in the castle was moving towards the entrance hall. This of course had to include Kai, Anna, Kristoff, and Sven, who came running to Olaf's excited shouts about the new friend he had just made and how fun he was. Apparently, whatever had been done to the snowman to throw him had not hurt him enough to convince the snowman that Naruto was not exactly keen on being his friend at the moment. But that could be explained to him later. A few minutes after everyone had gathered and had been given an explanation, an exasperated Elsa passed the ball she had been holding to Anna, who started spluttering about the fact that she was now holding her long-lost ball. Elsa left her sister to explain to their friends about the ball, hoping the story would distract them, especially Olaf, while she calmed Naruto down. Or at least got him down from the rafters. Heading to the far side of the room, away from everyone else, Elsa called out to her friend, hoping she could coax him down. Thankfully Naruto was willing to at least respond to her as he stuck his head out from behind a particularly high rafter when he heard her. "Naruto, come down here," Elsa called out in the calmest voice her stressed out state would allow. Thankfully Olaf's loud happy talking, that would have caused Naruto to disappear again, was hard to hear from across the hall. Seemed her tactic of giving Anna the ball had worked. Unfortunately Naruto still couldn't understand her and instead chose to look between her and the living snowman, who was now ogling the ball that had been rescued earlier. Not getting a response from Naruto caused a bit of worry for Elsa, but she continued on trying to easy her friend from his hiding spot. A few minutes later, with no success, Elsa decided to try another approach. But the stomp of her foot that caused some frost to fly up behind her, pulling Naruto's attention towards her and away from Olaf. Looking directly into her friend's eyes, Elsa pointed a finger at the ground right beside her and called his name using the, as Anna called it, royal commanding voice. The same voice Anna herself used on Kristoff occasionally. Elsa chose not to compare her using the voice on Naruto with Anna using it on her boyfriend. However, the effects were identical. Where Kristoff would look dumbfounded for a few seconds before bursting into action, Naruto took a second to widen his eyes before he jumped off the rafter. A feat which caused some screams from the servants and Anna. Of course Naruto landed with barely a sound next to the queen. Giving a smile to her friend to show she wasn't angry with him, Elsa took his hand and turned towards the rest of the room. Who had all taken Naruto's jump in different ways. Kristoff had attempted a run forward to catch his fellow blonde, but had only made it halfway across the room. Anna and Sven had taken to covering their eyes with hands and hooves respectively. Kai and Gerda had grabbed onto each other. Several other servants looked away or had taken steps back. And Olaf had gotten over whatever shock he suffered and was now running towards Naruto, causing him to tense. Elsa, not about to risk things degrading back to their previous state, tightened her grip on Naruto's hand, looked towards the snowman, and simply commanded Olaf to stop. Apparently she was still in the mindset of using the royal commanding voice from earlier, causing Olaf skidded to a stop just before he passed Kristoff. After the snowman halted, Naruto relaxed immensely, and Elsa couldn't stop a sigh of relief from escaping her lips. Unfortunately, her rather loud command had caused all those present to stop hiding and notice that Naruto was fine. Which caused the others to take a few tentative steps towards him. This included a certain easily excitable animal who ignored Elsa's previous order completely and started charging towards the blonde that resembled said animal's best friend. Kristoff, hearing the thunder hoofs of his friend, reacted on instinct and moved in front of the reindeer to prevent his advance. Sven slowed to prevent a crash as Kristoff grabbed his friend to help slow him and hold him in place. Once the reindeer was stopped, Kristoff started apologizing to his friend and even made a comment about not wanting to smell burnt reindeer, which caused the other occupants of the room snapped out of their shock and realized that Sven had been with Olaf for the past week. And both were unaware of the danger from the seemingly innocent boy. Many of the servants ran forward to help the mountain man explain to Sven and Olaf about the superheated boy who didn't speak their language. Meanwhile, as the others were distracted by the charging reindeer, Naruto had taken action and grabbed Elsa and a princess carry before he jumped towards a high windowsill. While Elsa was amazed at the fact she was now being held on top of the tallest windowsill in the room, she was pleased that she now knew how Naruto was getting into the rafters. While the fact he could jump so high was odd, it was much more reasonable than something else, like if he was switching places with a log or something. But she needed to be put those thoughts on hold as she felt the small amount of heat, no warmer than a hug, that passed through Naruto's jacket, start to melt her frozen dress. Again. It wasn't going to melt completely like before, she could feel parts of her dress break away where Naruto was holding her. Even though she knew her dress could hold up to even higher temperatures than Naruto was currently giving off, her dress just seemed to melt around him. If this kept up, she'd need to make a suit of armor out of her eyes so Naruto could hug her more often. And upon realizing what she had just thought, Elsa shoved that idea into the farthest reaches of her mind indefinitely. Instead, she focused her thoughts on how she was going to get Naruto to take her back down before her dress melted further. It wasn't like she could fix the damage while in his arms. Although he probably wouldn't even know what was going on if she did. Though no matter how much Elsa thought she wanted to get out of Naruto's arms, she couldn't stop herself from spending several seconds just quietly staring at his handsome face as his warm arms held her protectively. She actually spent so long looking at him that she almost missed her name being called by her sister. Turning her head to look over the edge of the windowsill, Elsa saw her friends and family looking around, presumably for her and Naruto. Olaf and Sven were helping everyone else look with concerned faces, so hopefully they were now aware of Naruto's problem. Which was good news for her, since now she only had to convince Naruto that the snowman and reindeer weren't going to hurt him. After she got him to take her down. "We're up here," Elsa called out, drawing everyone's attention to their queen being held in the windowsill. She figured that the best way to keep everyone calm was to alert all of them to her and Naruto's location. While many of the servants had started pointing and staring at the two of them, they had at least stopped moving, so with any luck, Naruto would be able to jump back down and land in a clear area. "Naruto down," Elsa commanded as simply as possible while she pointed towards the floor, hoping that he not only understood her want, but also that he might have learned the word down. Thankfully he did seem to understand as after looking at her for a few seconds, before looking at everyone else. She felt Naruto tense before he gave a small push with his legs that sent them flying through the air. It felt like only a second passed before the two of them landed on the far side of the room from everyone else, and specifically Olaf and Sven if she had to guess. Thankfully as soon as they landed Naruto lowered his arms so she could move out of his arms. And while disappointed at the loss of heat Elsa hurriedly put a foot on the ground but kept a hand on Naruto at all times so he couldn't run away. Once standing on both legs, Elsa quickly waved her free hand behind her back, quickly fixing her dress. Thankfully the way Naruto had landed meant no one saw the melted back of her dress yet, so there shouldn't be any uncomfortable questions about it. Especially since if someone was melting the clothes of the queen, the people, her royal court, and the other nations would demand that she not associate with such a man. The back of her dress fixed, Naruto not running anywhere, and Olaf and Sven standing well back, meant that the continuous chaos had finally stopped and allowed for a calm and rational introduction for Naruto, Olaf, and Sven. She hoped. So projecting an image of cool composed confidence, Elsa took Naruto's hand in her own and walked with him towards the rest of the group. Taking measured steps to ensure nothing spooked her friend or caused another outburst until they were only a few steps away from the rest of the group. Standing with Naruto next to her cautiously watching everyone, but at least no longer looking like he would attack anything that moved towards him. Which was a good thing considering how strong he had to be to jump as high as he does. Giving a reassuring squeeze to Naruto's hand, Elsa calmly and softly called both Olaf and Sven to walk towards them. "Naruto," Elsa called getting his attention on her while the two non-humans moved towards them. "Sven," she said while pointing at the reindeer, who gave a low grunt in acknowledgement of his name being called. Elsa had specifically left all words except names out of her speech so as not to confuse the blonde. Tightening her grip a little to draw Naruto's attention back to her, Elsa pointed at her other friend. Olaf, she pointed towards the snowman standing in front of them and waved slowly at Naruto, now that he was aware of how dangerous the blonde was. Naruto waved back in acknowledgement of the living snowman, but still kept his distance. Noticing Naruto's hesitation, Elsa waved her free hand in the air to conjure a small blizzard that condensed into a non-living likeness of Olaf, save for the carrot nose. Hopefully Naruto now understood what the living snowman was and that she had created him. He must have understood something, because as he looked at the small snow statue he returned to his normal enthusiastic demeanor while saying something in his own language. Giving another wave of her hand and a burst of magic, Elsa turned the olive-shaped pile of snow into a flurry that flew around the room, much to everyone's enjoyment, before dispersing into the air. The queen really didn't want to accidentally make another living snowman like she did with Olaf, by leaving the look-alike just standing there, like she did with Olaf on the mountain. Even if she had no clue how Olaf came to life. Hearing the sound of clapping from those present at her magical display, Elsa gave a small wave to the crowd, hoping they would calm down and stop making such a big deal of her magic. She was about to say something to that effect when she felt a light squeeze on her arm from Naruto, who did nothing afterward but smile at her. Whether he was aware of how she didn't like to show off her powers or something more, Elsa decided to just enjoy the moment with her friends. Especially since no one was causing Naruto to jump away. When the clapping had died down enough that Elsa could talk, she turned and addressed the servants. "Now that we have had some fun for today, I think it's time that we all return to our duties." But the servants leaving to perform their given tasks now that the excitement had passed, the only ones left were the queen, her sister, Naruto, Kristoff, Sven, and Olaf. Now alone with her friends and sister, Elsa looked towards the living snowman. "Olaf, where have you been for the past week?" she asked in a calm voice. The living snowman was silent for a few seconds until he pointed out the door towards the mountain in the far distance. "I was out in the countryside gathering flowers to give you guys. Sven was there with me too, but he didn't do anything besides follow me," the excited snowman said as he ran outside only to return with a huge bouquet of purple flowers. which he started handing out to all present including Elsa, who got a slightly smaller bunch than Anna, Sven, who just ate his, Naruto, whose flowers didn't burst into flames because of his gloves, and Kristoff. Said Ice Harvester just gave his to his girlfriend, while Naruto, seeing the act, gave his flowers to Elsa, failing to see the soft red glow that now adorned her cheeks. Using the flowers to hide her blush from view, she moved her hand, so it was now holding Naruto's, and proceeded to guide him towards the kitchens, stating that she and Naruto would grab dinner before she would take him back to his room. Elsa only looked back for a few seconds when she heard her sister sneeze, causing a shower of petals to fall over the entrance hall. Continuing on her quest to feed herself and her blonde friend, the queen missed the strange look her sister gave her. After Anna had sneezed into the flowers, she had looked at her sister's retreating back and noticed that the back of her dress was a lot more plain than it usually was. Almost like she had to dress quickly instead of taking the time to form her dress correctly. Break. Returning Naruto to his room for the night before retiring to her own, Elsa stood before a full-length mirror, looking at her shimmering dress made of ice and frost. Twice today her dress had melted slightly when Naruto held her. Having experimented with her powers, she knew she could make her dress strong enough to withstand a burning fire, so she was pretty sure her dress could stand up to a hug by Naruto. Especially if he was wearing the special clothes she had made for him. But it didn't, and that worried her. She feared that Naruto might not be getting better like she thought he was if his temperature was high enough to melt her ice, but another part of her subconscious knew that he was going to be just fine. With how energetic he was today, she couldn't help but smile at the thought that Naruto would be healthy soon. Healthy enough that he might leave her. The sadness that descended over her at that thought caused her to flash freeze her entire room. She really didn't know why, but she felt a chill at the thought of Naruto not being around. Her next thought probably wouldn't have occurred to her if the wind from an open window pushed her dress against her body and caused her to shiver from the cold of her dress. She was cold. A feeling that she hadn't felt in forever and caused her to break from her thoughts of Naruto leaving as she realized just how cold she was. She was freezing. Her icy dress felt cold to her because Naruto wasn't around to warm her up. She had grown so accustomed to having Naruto around her that when she was away from him, the cold did bother her. Forced to admit that her dress was cold, Elsa let the traitorous cloth melt away like it had been trying to all day. Left with nothing blocking the view of her pale skin in the mirror, Elsa for the first time in a while looked at her body. Elsa would admit that she had a nice figure. She had seen many men in the village turn to look at her as she passed, and not just because she was the queen. Even a few of her suitors seemed more interested in her than her power or land. Those were her more genuine suitors, because at least they acknowledged her as more than a queen who had mystic powers. But even then she was still known as the Snow Queen and was said to be as pure as the freshly fallen snow of her title. So many people, from her own kingdom to those far away, were very adamant that when she marry, it must be to someone worthy of her status and powers. And if the other kingdoms have their say, it would be their princes that would woo her. But she never thought of marriage. Mainly because from the time that she had accidentally hurt Anna and onward, Elsa had thought of herself as a monster. She was a danger to everyone that she was near, so couldn't dare to think about getting close to anyone new. Let alone a boy when she was old enough. Throughout puberty Elsa couldn't stand herself. She found it difficult to wonder about boys while she was trying to prevent herself from hurting anyone if she lost control. Now that she was older and had her powers under control, not to mention being the queen, her schedule was too full to worry about boys and husbands. In fact, the only boy her age she spent any time around during the past year was Kristoff, and for as nice and caring as he was, Anna didn't need to worry about him being stolen from her. The reindeer man just didn't do it for the queen. But then Naruto showed up. At first she spent so much time around the blonde to keep an eye on him. Then it was to keep him company after he figured out he couldn't leave the bed. And even now she found herself making excuses to stay near him. The current one being that she was going to teach him to speak their language. She could have just ordered one of the tutors to teach him, but he seems to learn better by doing, so she could be there to help him. Now that he's better, a servant could take over watching him while she worked in her study. Of course no one in the castle understood Naruto like she did. Naruto would of course worry about her if she disappeared after she spent so much time with him. And she didn't want to worry him. And there she was making more excuses to be around her friend. In the confines of her room, standing bare in front of her mirror with nothing to hide, Elsa could let out the truth that the real reason that she was always around Naruto was because she felt he could relate to her on an emotional level. She had been isolated for years, and now Naruto was alone in a land he knew nothing about and couldn't even say what he wanted to. After the fiasco that had been her coronation was settled, Elsa had silently vowed to herself that she didn't want anyone else to suffer the same loneliness that she did. So she would stick beside Naruto, and the sole reward that she wanted was to see that dazzling smile he would give her. That smile that caused her own body to heat up enough that she thought her dress would melt off her, even without being around Naruto. Her whole world seemed to become much brighter when he was smiling at her. His sapphire eyes would sparkle as his golden hair caught the rays from the sun. Elsa's dream of Naruto was ruined when a loud moan sounded across her room and pulling her from her thoughts as she noticed her own hands exploring her body on their own accord. Mildly horrified at what she was about to do, Elsa pulled her hands away from her body. Nightgown forgotten, Elsa almost jumped into her bed and hid beneath the confines of the covers, telling herself that she was just under a lot of stress lately. And she shouldn't pull her friend into her perverted fantasies. But as she laid in bed half asleep, one final thought crossed her mind. That maybe on a subconscious level, she had wanted her dress to melt around Naruto. That would explain her dress's fragility, but why would she? Maybe it was to get closer to the heat of Naruto's body that her own craved, or possibly something even more primal. Whatever the answer was would remain a mystery for the night as the queen slipped off to the land of dreams. Forgetting the thoughts she had when she woke up the next morning. Break. The next morning had been interesting for Elsa. After she had woken up and gotten ready for the day, she went to check on Naruto. And was greeted by the sight of a sweaty Naruto doing push-ups without a shirt. From what Elsa could get from his gestures, Naruto thought that since he had been let out of his bed yesterday, he was now allowed to be out of his bed at any time, and as much as she wanted to argue, he didn't seem to be overheating, so she allowed it for now. For the next several hours, Elsa sat at the desk she had in the room, while Naruto alternated between different stationary exercises. All of which he performed shirtless. And even though he hadn't worn a shirt for the entire week he had been bedridden, Elsa found it difficult to concentrate on her paperwork. Thankfully, one of the servants had come into the room with a message that her head servant Kai needed her down at the docks where a merchant ship had some odd items. So pulling herself away from her work and the distracting sight of Naruto's workout, Elsa now found herself standing before the merchants Kai had insisted she meet. "Alright Kai, why did you need me?" Elsa started off in the soft tone she used for diplomatic purposes or while she was in front of sailing merchants. "I'm sorry to bother you, your majesty, but while I was down here at the docks, I mentioned our guest's name and these fine men recognized it as a foreign word," the head servant said. "Best, Kai?" Elsa asked. "Your man here said his name was Naruto, milady," one of the merchants said as he gave a short bow to the queen before him. "Oh, yes, Naruto. He's around so much I almost forgot that he was a guest and not a permanent resident of the castle," Elsa quickly replied, having actually forgotten that Naruto was just a guest for the time being. "He certainly draws attention to himself, my queen," Kai said as he tried to hid a smile at the memories of yesterday's events. "But these men claim that the word Naruto actually means maelstrom in Japan of all places." "Aye, your majesty, we just came back from the Orient where we got a book to help us learn some words to help our sails." "You have a book?" the queen asked in shock. "That was the reason I asked for you to come, your majesty. These men have a book on the Japanese language, which I believe Naruto speaks," Kai said. Elsa saw one of the men hold up a book that appeared to be well preserved for having been on a ship. "Some linguist set up shop in Japan and makes a living by writing language books. We bought a set to help with trade and we learned all we needed, so we would be happy to sell them," the sailor said as he motioned to a few more books behind him. Elsa almost couldn't believe how lucky the situation was. She had planned on teaching Naruto her native language just as one would a child and still probably would have too. But if these books could tell her words to help Naruto learn faster, that could increase his learning exponentially. And all it would take was for Naruto to actually be speaking Japanese and not something else. "May I look at those books before we buy them?" Elsa asked, trying to keep the excitement out of her voice. "I would like to make sure that these will work for what we need them to." At an affirmative, Elsa picked up one of the books and began to leaf through the pages, looking for any words that she knew from her time with Naruto. It only took a few seconds before she found several words she thought sounded familiar, but not quite, as she continued to look. And then she found it. Elsa didn't feel the need to continue looking as her eyes looked down towards the page, as the one word she had longed to know was now understood by her. Haim, the word Naruto called her and only her, was finally known by her to mean princess. And that made it all the better. Naruto knew she was a princess and still treated her like just another girl. While she had resigned herself to the fact that as queen, when she walked down the street, she would be given formal hellos and respectful bows, while her sister was given casual greetings like she was an old friend come to visit. It didn't bother Elsa a great deal, being that she was used to avoiding people. But now instead of her avoiding people for their protection, everyone else avoided her because she was queen. Not in the running away kind of avoiding, but in the way where the townspeople would never get close enough to know her for who she was. But Naruto didn't. Elsa had felt he was aware she was important, but since he seemed to have learned that she was a princess yesterday, he hadn't changed at all. He still smiled at her in that genuine way that only he could. He would poke her in the arm to get her attention, and even this morning while she was doing paperwork. She had let out a sigh of frustration from the mountain of work she had left, and he came over to rub her shoulders. Nothing overly intimate, he just rubbed her shoulders to help ease her tension. His increased body heat helped immensely too, but she had to stop him before he melted her gown again. Turning towards the sailors and trying to hide the pure excitement that she could finally do something for Naruto besides keep him cool, and asked how much the books were. "We haven't really set a price yet, your majesty," a sailor answered truthfully. "Well, we're thinking of a price. Would you care to browse the rest of our wares from Japan? Your guest would probably like something from his home," a sailor said as he tried to entice the queen into buying more items from them. "Unfortunately, I am too busy to browse today," Elsa replied, having spent most of her life learning about politics and how to deal with them meant that she saw right through the merchant. He wasn't a bad man, he just wanted to get the most money that he could. "But, my shrewd head servant Kai here will gladly strike a fair deal with you and possibly buy anything else he believes Naruto might need during his stay," Elsa finished as she gestured towards her loyal servant. "Of course, Queen Elsa, I'll be sure to work out a suitable prince and I'll see what else I can find for the young man. Maybe some foreign eating utensils, he seems so uncomfortable with a fork and knife," Kai said as he smiled at the thought of haggling with the merchants. Kai always did have a vindictive streak, that's why last year she let him deal with Hans and the Duke of Wesselton. Giving a smile to the now nervous merchants, Elsa turned and began walking back into town, knowing that Kai would get the books for a fair price. He also had a fair point about the fact that Naruto was always uncomfortable with a fork and knife, so maybe they used something else over in Japan. If that was where he was from. About halfway back to the castle, Elsa heard a shout from one of the townspeople that made her heart stop. There was a fire in the village. The end. So how was this part? I hope you like it. And if you like it, share this part with your friends and like the video too. And don't forget to subscribe our channel for daily awesome fanfiction. Okay, it's time for me to go. Bye bye.